Rather, one must certainly search for a possibility of expressing the pure and immediate unity of labor in a symbol that functions as a means of exchange and measurement, that functions as money. Without pronouncing on which of the proposed unifications of value is the sole legitimate one, I wish to assert that the labor theory of value is, at least philosophically, the most interesting theory. The material and intellectual aspects of human beings, their intellect and there will gain a unity in work that remains inaccessible to these potentialities so long as one views them, as it were, in peaceful coexistence. Work is the unified stream in which they mix like river sources, extinguishing the diversity of their nature in the similarity of the product. If work was really the sole agent of value, then the latter would thus be submerged in the specific point of unity of our practical nature, and this would have to choose the most adequate expression that it can find in external reality. It seems to me, in the light of this importance of work, that it is a secondary question as to whether or not one has to deny that, as a result, labor itself first produces values, just like the machine that works on a material that does not yet itself possess the form that it confers upon it. Certainly, if one only accords value to the products of human labor, then labor cannot itself possess value. It is a physiological function rather, only labor power possesses value. Clearly, this can be produced only by human beings, namely through the means of subsistence which in turn stem from human work. That it is then transposed into real work clearly does not require more work and thus itself implies no value, rather, this only adheres to the products of such labor. Nonetheless, I take this to be a basically terminological issue. For since labor power is certainly not a value if it remains latent, and if it is not transposed into real work but rather only operates in this value-forming work, then one can employ labor for all purposes of calculation and expression. Furthermore, this situation is not changed by the consideration that the values consumed as subsistence are not produced by labor but by labor power, and therefore only labor power as the bearer of these values can itself be a value. Therefore, the means of subsistence cannot be the sufficient cause of the value realized by human beings because this value exceeds that invested in the former, since it can otherwise never supply an increase in value. The division between labor power and labor is important only for the purposes of socialism, because it illustrates the theory that the worker retains only a part of the value that he produces. His work produces more values than are invested in his labor power in the form of means of subsistence. In so far as the employer purchases the whole of the labor power for the value of the means of subsistence, he profits from the whole of the surplus by which the ultimate product of labor exceeds this value. But even viewed from this standpoint, it seems to me that one could, instead of labor power, characterize labor itself as value and separate out from one another the amounts whose values comprise, on the one hand, a wage to the worker, and, on the other, the employer's profit. I wish not to go into this any further here but to investigate in what follows only the more immediate evaluation with which the labor theory of value confronts us so frequently. It searches for a concept of labor that is equally valid for manual and mental labor and, in so doing, actually appeals to manual labor as the primary value or value-producing entity that is valid as the measure of work as a whole. It would be erroneous to see in this merely proletarian spite and fundamental depreciation of intellectual achievements. On the contrary, deeper and more varied causes are at work here. The unpaid contribution of mental effort with regard to the share of the intellect in work. It is first of all asserted that it is not a cost, since it requires no compensation owing to depreciation and therefore does not raise the costs of the product. Thus, only manual labor is left as the foundation of exchange value. If, on the contrary, one emphasizes that mental energy is also creative and must be maintained and compensated for by nourishment to exactly the same degree as labor power, then the element of truth is overlooked that this theory may be the basis for this view, even if only as an instinctive feeling. The share of the intellect in a product of labor implies two aspects that must be sharply distinguished. If a joiner makes a chair according to a well-tried model, then this is certainly not accomplished without a share of mental activity. The hand must be directed by the mind. Yet this is by no means all the mental activity that is invested in the chair. It could also not be produced without the mental activity of those who, perhaps generations ago, had invented such a design. The mental energy used here also forms a practical precondition for this chair. However, the content of this second mental process exists in a further form that no longer involves any mental expenditure of energy, namely as tradition, as objectivated thought which anyone can take up and reflect upon. In this form it affects the production process of the contemporary joiner and forms the content of the real mental function, which, of course, must be carried on and completed by its subjective power and by means of which it enters into the product as its form. The two mental activities of which I first spoke are quite certainly subordinated to the depreciation and the necessity of physiological compensation, both that of the joiner and that of the inventor of the chair. But the third mental factor that is certainly decisively important for the present production of the chair is indeed removed from potential consumption, and on the basis of the plan of this chair thousands of copies can be produced. The plan itself thereby suffers no depreciation, requires no restoration and certainly does not increase the cost of such chairs even though it constitutes the form-giving, material intellectual content of each individual chair of this type. If one distinguishes with the necessary precision between the objective mental content contained in a product and the subjective mental function that produces the product according to the model of its content, then one can see the relative justification for the assertion that mental activity has no cost. One can, of course, also see the relative injustice of this assertion, since this uncompensatable and unusable notion of the object is itself realized not in products but only by means of an intellect which demands this idea of the appropriate functioning of organic energy and contributes to the cost value of the product on the same grounds as does manual labor, even though the mental expenditure that is associated with such a preformed content is much less than if it had, at the same time, originally produced this content. The difference between the two is the gratuitous achievement of the mind. And it is this ideal factor that so completely distinguishes mental from economic possession in two respects. On the one hand, it can be so much more basic, on the other, it can be so much less accepted than the latter. The thought that has been once expressed can no longer be captured again by any amount of power in the world. Its content is irrevocably the public property of all who apply the mental energy necessary to recall it. By the same token, however, once it has appeared, it cannot be stolen again by any amount of power in the world. Once expressed, the thought remains indivisibly bound up with the personality as a constantly reproducible content in a manner that has no analogy in the economic sphere. In so far as, in terms of its content, the intellectual process possesses this supraeconomic importance, and as such constitutes the psychological process, we are obviously concerned here only with the latter, with the question of the role that the mental expenditure of energy plays in the creation of value alongside manual labor. The reduction of the importance of mental labor to that of physical labor is ultimately only one side of the whole general tendency to produce a unified concept of labor. What has to be discovered is the common factor in all the diverse types of labor, a much broader and more differentiated diversity than is expressed in the mere opposition of physical and mental labor. If this were achieved, then an extraordinarily large theoretical and practical gain would be made, as much in fact as the gain from the existence of money. One would then gain the general, qualitative unit on the basis of which all value relationships between the results of human activity could be expressed purely quantitatively through greater or smaller amounts.